Knowing the right camera mode to use in a given situation is what sets the beginner apart from the pro photographer. In this video, I'm going to quickly explain what each camera exposure mode is, what it's for, and how it works. And by the end of the video, you're going to have a much better understanding of how and when to use each camera mode. And just keep in mind that the camera modes control exposure, which is basically how light is recorded to create your images. All right, so before we dive into the different camera modes, let's just take a moment to talk about what exposure actually is. In photography, exposure refers to how bright or dark an image is. I mean, this is an oversimplified definition, but getting the right exposure means that your photo isn't too light, where the details are washed out, or too dark, where the shadows hide important details. So there's one caveat. The so-called right exposure or correct exposure is very subjective. You might intentionally want your image to be brighter or darker than normal in some cases. Exposure is controlled by three key settings. That's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And these three settings form what we call the exposure triangle. And each of these three settings plays a really unique role in the triangle. Now, aperture controls the amount of light entering the lens. Shutter speed controls how long the camera's sensor is exposed to the light, and ISO adjusts the sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, there are more precise technical explanations for these settings, but it's useful to think of them in these kind of simple ways. Now, the settings are interdependent. So if you're taking a photo and you change one of these settings, you're going to have to change one or both of the others just to keep the exposure in balance. So understanding exposure means knowing how to adjust these settings to get the look you want, whether you're in bright sunlight or a dimly lit room, and it's all about just keeping settings in balance. Okay, before we get into the explanations of each camera mode, just keep in mind that different manufacturers have different ways of handling these modes. And we're going to cover them more or less generically here, so make sure you check your manual to see exactly how each mode affects different exposure settings and other functions with your camera. All right, so getting into the actual camera modes. Let's start with auto mode. Auto is the fully automatic mode on your camera. And in this mode, the camera makes all the decisions for you. It chooses the aperture, chooses the shutter speed, and the ISO, and even white balance. Auto is good for beginners or when you need to take a quick snapshot without worrying about any of the settings. But here's the catch. While auto mode is pretty convenient, it takes away your creative control. The camera might choose settings that don't give you the look that you want. And here's an example. If you're trying to get a nice blurry background in a portrait, auto mode might not get you there because it doesn't prioritize depth of field. So in terms of the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, auto mode takes control of all three. So auto's a good starting point, but as you move past the, ultra beginner phase, you're going to want more control to get exactly the results that you're looking for. Next up is program mode, or P mode. And this is what we call a semi-automatic mode. In program mode, the camera still chooses the aperture and shutter speed for you, just like in auto, but the difference is that you have control over some other settings like ISO, white balance, and exposure compensation. Now, program mode is good for general photography when you want more flexibility than auto, but without going full manual. So if you're in a hurry, but you still want to tweak some of the settings, you might want to be using P mode. In the context of the exposure triangle, P mode allows you to control ISO manually, while the camera automatically adjusts the aperture and shutter speed based on that ISO. And you can also shift the balance between aperture and shutter speed to prioritize one over the other while still keeping the exposure consistent when you're in P mode. Next up is one of my favorite modes, and that's Aperture Priority. And yes, this is a mode that's commonly used by professionals. A lot of people will tell you professionals only use manual mode. That is not true. Okay, so aperture mode is also known as A or AV mode, depending on your camera. And in this mode, you control the aperture, which is the size of the opening in your lens. The camera then adjusts the shutter speed automatically to match your chosen aperture for proper exposure. Aperture Priority mode is great for when you want to control the depth of field in your photos, which is how much of the scene is in focus. For example, in portrait photography, you might want a shallow depth of field to blur the background and make your subject stand out. And by setting a wide aperture, you can achieve that look. And the camera is just going to make sure it sets the shutter speed appropriately. With Aperture Priority, you're directly influencing one side of the exposure triangle, that's the aperture, while the camera adjusts the shutter speed to balance the exposure. This mode is especially useful when lighting conditions are changing and you still want to maintain control over the depth of field. Shutter Priority mode, marked as S or TV on your camera. And why is it marked TV sometimes? Well, that's an old term used for time value. But we're talking about the shutter. And this works in kind of the opposite way to Aperture Priority. In this mode, you choose the shutter speed and the camera selects the appropriate aperture to make sure that you get a balanced exposure. A Shutter Priority mode is perfect for controlling motion in your photos. For example, if you're photographing a fast-moving subject like a car or someone running, you might want to freeze that motion by using a fast shutter speed. On the other hand, if you want to capture motion blur, like the flowing of water, you'd use a slower shutter speed. And in terms of the exposure triangle, Shutter Priority allows you to control the shutter speed while the camera adjusts the aperture to keep the exposure balanced. And this is an excellent choice when your main concern is how movement is rendered in your shot. Finally, we have Manual Mode or M mode. And this is a mode where you have full control over every aspect of your exposure. You set the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO yourself. And I realize that you can set auto ISO with some cameras in manual mode, but I'm going to give you the full manual definition, the traditional one. This mode gives you the most creative freedom, allowing you to tailor your camera settings exactly to the scene that you're capturing. Manual mode is especially useful in challenging lighting situations where you want complete control. For example, in a low light environment, you might need to adjust all three settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, if you want to avoid underexposure or overexposure. It's also the go-to mode for photographers who want to experiment and push their creative boundaries, or if you want to do studio quality flash photography. In the exposure triangle, you're controlling all three corners, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. This mode requires way more knowledge and experience than, let's say, something like auto, but it's incredibly rewarding once you've mastered it. It is the best way to ensure that your photos turn out exactly the way that you envision them.
If you're ready to take the next step, I've got a course called Flash Portraits Made Simple that walks you through from setting up your first light to building confident, creative lighting setups that you can use anywhere. Flash Portraits Made Simple is built for photographers who want to feel confident with Flash, even if they've struggled with it before or they're just getting started. Inside, I walk you through all the fundamentals: off-camera flash setups, exposure settings, working in TTL and manual, plus how to build 5 of the most useful lighting patterns with just one flash. You'll see exactly how I do it in my own home studio and how you can do the same in your space, even if it's small. I've stripped out all the fluff and made it really easy to follow, so you're not spending hours trying to decode technical jargon or watch 5 different videos to figure out where to start. You're also going to get bonus guides and cheat sheets to speed things up. And the course is on demand, so you can learn at your own pace and refer back to it anytime. And of course, it's backed by my 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no pressure, no risk. So if you're ready to take control of your lighting and start creating portraits that you're proud of from your home studio, just click the link below to get started, and I'll see you inside.
Now let's take a quick look at some of the special and creative modes that your camera might offer. And these modes are designed to simplify shooting in specific scenarios by automatically adjusting the settings for you. For example, you might find that there's a portrait mode that sets a wide aperture to blur the background, or a landscape mode that keeps everything in focus by using a smaller aperture. And there are also modes like night scene and sports and macro, and each of these are optimized for different situations. Now, these modes can be really handy, but they do limit your control over individual settings. The camera makes the decisions for you based on what it thinks is going to work best, which can be useful in a pinch, but might not always give you the exact results that you're after. So these creative modes are really great for quick and easy shooting, especially if you're brand new to photography, if you're still learning, or you just need a fast solution. But as you become more comfortable with your camera, it's more than likely that you're going to find that these modes don't offer enough creative control. Now that we've covered the basics of exposure and camera modes, let's just talk a little bit about how flash photography adds a whole new layer of complexity. So when you introduce flash into the equation, you're no longer just dealing with natural or ambient light like we've been talking about. You're also having to manage the light from your flash. And flash can really be a game changer in tricky lighting situations, but it does require a good understanding of how it interacts with your camera settings. For example, when you use flash, your shutter speed often has to be within a certain range to sync with the flash. And you do need to balance the intensity of the flash with your aperture and ISO settings to get a natural looking result. And this is why mastering the basics of exposure is so important before jumping into flash photography. Once you've got a really solid grasp of how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO work together, learning how to use flash becomes a whole lot easier. And here's a tip. A lot of modern cameras come with TTL, or through the lens metering for flash. And TTL is one of these things that can automatically adjust the flash output based on the scene, making it really helpful, really useful tool for beginners. TTL allows you to focus on actually taking the picture, on your composition, and the camera handles the flash exposure for you. Just remember, like all auto modes, TTL does have its limits. So again, understanding how it works is going to help you be able to use it more effectively. Once you get more advanced, you're going to want to use flash on manual mode much of the time. So wrapping up, remember that mastering your camera's modes is a key step to becoming a more confident and creative photographer. And by understanding how each of these modes work, whether it's auto, program, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual, understanding these things, you're going to be able to take control of your exposure settings to get the images to look the way that you want them to. Definitely experiment and see what works best for you in different situations. The more you practice, the more intuitive it's going to become. And as you gain confidence, you're going to find out that knowing how to adjust your settings is going to make all the difference with your photography. So take what you've learned today, get out there and start shooting. Because, the best way to grow as a photographer is through experience. So keep learning, keep experimenting. Most importantly, keep creating. Hey, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. That's about all I've got for you today. I'll see you next time.